Welcome to Question Time, the programme where the audience can put questions directly to those in power and those who want to be in power. Tonight we're in the seaside town of Aberystwyth in West Wales. Plaid Cymru hold the Westminster and Welsh Parliament constituency seat here, but it's Labour who've run the devolved government in Wales for over 20 years. Tonight we're talking about that royal race row. Not everyone here agrees with the way the palace has handled it, and the crisis in ambulance waiting times. Believe me, you will want to hear the stories from our audience. Welcome to Question Time. On the panel, from the government, the Secretary of State for Wales for the past month or so, David T.C. Davies. The MP for Monmouth was a junior minister in Boris Johnson's government and is also a keen boxer, the self-styled Tory Tornado. Retired, he says. He's just got back from supporting Wales in their World Cup match against England in Qatar. From the Labour-run Welsh government is Vaughan Gething, also fresh from a trip to Qatar. Promise we won't talk about the World Cup, or maybe we will. Mr. Gething is Economy Minister and his party have exactly half of the seats in the Welsh Parliament or Senedd. Adam Price is the leader of Plaid Cymru. They remain committed to Welsh independence and have just under a quarter of seats in the Senedd. A year ago, his party signed a deal to work together with Labour on a number of policy areas, but they don't call it a coalition. Olivia Utley is former assistant comment editor at The Telegraph. Before that, a leader writer at The Sun. Recently, she moved into TV and is political reporter at GB News, and all that before she's even 30. And Shavanah Taj is General Secretary of the Welsh Trades Union Congress, the organisation that looks after the interests of around 400,000 workers here in Wales. Good evening, welcome to Question Time from Aberystwyth University as it celebrates 150 years as Wales's oldest university. Welcome to our panel here, of course, welcome to our audience, and of course to you at home. Do join in the debate in the usual way on social media at BBC Question Time, and we'll hear what you've got to say. OK, our first question tonight is from Margaret Jordan.
Lady Hussey repeatedly asked Nugesi Fuloni, where are you really from? Is this more evidence of racism in the royal household?
So this is a story that blew up yesterday and is still making headlines today. Vaughan, you've talked about racism that you've experienced on when you've been on Question Time before. What was your response to this particular story?
I felt really sad for the person who this had happened to. What should have been recognition for the work that person does, because actually Camilla, the Queen Consort, had invited people there to try to focus on domestic abuse, the violence against women, and to recognise the issue, but also to promote what people are doing to do something about it, to help survivors.
Yes, so we should say that Ngozi Fulani she's from something called Sister Space. It's a black women's domestic abuse charity.
But I wasn't terribly surprised that something like this had happened.
I mean, for those of you who haven't seen it, Ngozi was repeatedly asked where she was from.
And that's a conversation I think lots of people like me and Shavanah will be familiar with. People don't want to accept that you're really British and you must be from somewhere else. I was actually born in Zambia. My father was born in South Wales. My mother is from Zambia. And you do get asked at various points in life, where are you really from? They're really saying, I don't believe you're one of us. And that's the problem. But it isn't just the one person in the royal household. There are people like that in society. So rather than saying there's one person in the royal household, there must be others, it's actually, this is a challenge that exists within our country. It's part of the reason why I'm proud to be part of a government that wants to have an anti-racist Wales, not to say I'm not a racist, that's OK, but to do something positive about promoting a better set of values in our country and to be prepared to support others in calling this out and recognise it's in all of our interests to recognise this behaviour as a problem, not to simply dismiss it. But I'm afraid that it'll be some time before we see fewer people having to go through this sort of experience. So disappointed and saddened, but sadly not surprised.
And Shavanah, also I'm going to come to you in a minute as well. Olivia, what do you make of the story itself and of the response of the palace? You've moved very swiftly, put out comments condemning it, and also the woman in question, Lady Susan Hussey, is no longer in post.
Yeah, well, I think it was definitely a very clumsy and surprisingly crass comment for someone who spent their life doing these sort of events. But on the other hand, I think it's a bit sad that we live in a sort of society where an 83-year-old woman with 60 years of public service behind her can just be sort of cancelled for one misspeak. And my heart really goes out to Ngozi Fulani because it sounds like a horrible experience and I can't quite understand how it happened like that. But I think that everyone who knows Lady Susan Hussey says that she's not in any way racist. She's a very kind-hearted woman, and the rest of her life is going to be blighted by that incident. So I worry a bit about the sort of cancel culture angle of this whole story, but that's not in any way to undermine what Ngozi Fulani went through, because it does sound like a horrible experience.
Man here.
So the questioner didn't bring age into it. No one else brought age into it. What age is it acceptable to say racist things then? Because I've had really uncomfortable, well, when they were alive, conversations with my grandparents, and it's really awkward and uncomfortable because they would say things. But I think we've all been in a situation when we go, oh, well, it's a generation, or, oh, it's, you know, they're old, don't upset them. But you've implied that age is a factor.
Well, yeah, I think age is a factor. I think that this is a generation that grew up in a completely different time. They went through completely different experiences to us. Lady Susan Hussey lived through the Second World War. They look at things in a different way, and I think it is important to be sensitive to that. And I'm saying, of course, that we should also be very sensitive to the feelings of people like Ngozi Fulani, who obviously felt very hurt by this. But I think to completely ignore the age factor would be absurd.
OK, but Vaughan, I can see you're shaking your head at that. I just want to bring Shavanah in, if you don't mind. Shavanah.
What happened yesterday was...
it was on Tuesday.
Sorry, on Tuesday, I think is actually, for me, it's the experience of most people who look like me, and Vaughan, as Vaughan has already mentioned.
And can I ask, because Ngozi Fulani has described it as abuse, is that how you would describe it?
I would describe it as racial abuse. That's what it was. Her hair was moved to the side in order for her past to be seen, so that the person who was speaking to her could work out exactly where she was from. I think that it's also important that we note that over the last 5 years alone, the majority of BME workers have reported being racially abused. You know, at that moment in time, where she was, that was her workplace. And so if we are... So it's really disappointing, but I think it's also...
Do you have any truck with what Olivia's saying?
Well, I think that we've got to get past this generational issue. I do believe that we've got to get past that. And that's why I think that what the Welsh Government is doing in terms of introducing an anti-racist Wales action plan will help us overcome some of these issues.
The man at the back there with the blonde hair, yeah.
Yeah, so I would say I agree with Vaughan. It's definitely sort of representative, I think, of a systemic issue across Britain. That whiteness is the default, that you can't be white, you can't be British, sorry, or Welsh if you're not white. And this was really sort of highlighted. So the ONS for the new census, originally you couldn't, if you were black or Asian, you couldn't tick anything other than British. So you couldn't identify as Welsh or English or Scottish. You had to be British. And I think those sort of comments of where you're from, they highlight there's a systemic issue across Britain. And I think it's really a bit of a privilege to say that, oh, you know, it's a generational issue, because we're never going to have to go through that. As a white person, I'm never going to have to be asked, where are you really from in my own country?
Man here in the front in the blue jacket and white shirt.
In my experience, it's not just about age, because my grandfather, I'm mixed race, so I come from a family that's from Wales and a family that's from Jamaica. And I've seen comments like that be made on both sides of this sort of, there's this generational gap, and I think the idea that we have to accept it is wrong. We should inspire change. I don't think that going outright to criticise and cancel people over things that they've said on a singular occasion is particularly correct, but
so do you think therefore then that Lady Susan Hussey perhaps should not have had to leave her job then?
No, I don't believe she should have had to leave her job. I believe a public apology and a sort of certain show of, you know, I've made a mistake, and we sort of use this as a lesson in moving forward. Of course, she is an older woman and she has made a mistake that is unacceptable, but to lose your job so immediately feels almost a bit rash. What if we had turned to the woman who had this abuse thrown at her, and she had turned around and gone, well, I don't think she should have lost her job over such an issue. So it's more on a personal level. I've experienced racism in my life, but it doesn't mean I want to ruin people's careers over it, but it is a contextual thing.
Okay. David, do you agree with that, that Susan Hussey perhaps, I think that's what you're saying, perhaps in these circumstances, and in fact, there has been an apology through the palace, but you're saying perhaps if this was a one-off, she shouldn't have lost her job. I think that's what you're saying.
I think, first of all, I agree with, I think, pretty much everything Vaughan Gething said, perhaps for the first time ever. And yes, I agree with this gentleman to an extent. I mean, let's be honest about it. It's fundamentally wrong to ever question whether or not somebody's British because of their ethnicity or where they were born or their religion or anything else. If somebody is identifying themselves as British or as Welsh and British or whatever, that should be good enough. So the question was absolutely wrong. I mean, the palace have issued an apology. I believe the ladies apologised. But I take this gentleman's point because I think what he's saying, sir, is that perhaps it would have been more forward-looking for those two people to have a conversation and for Mrs. Filoni to be able to explain why she felt hurt and why she had every right to feel hurt about that question being asked. And perhaps that would have been... And in fact, I think actually I listened to her being interviewed and I think she said she didn't want anyone vilified or to lose their job. She wanted to explain her position. So I suppose I agree entirely with what she said as well and what you were saying. So do you think the palace has overreacted then? No, I don't think so. I'm not going to second-guess the palace. I mean, they've made a statement and an apology has been issued. I'm not criticising the action they've taken, but I do wonder whether perhaps if Mrs. Filoni had perhaps made the point a bit earlier, and I'm not criticising her for not, by the way, perhaps that would have led to a conversation. But ultimately, fundamentally, it was wrong to ever ask that question. It's wrong to ask that question of people in the way that it was asked. And, as I said, I'd probably pretty much agree with everything I've heard. The man there in the black T-shirt.
You said that she was being cancelled, Lady Hussey, because she misspoke. But if you're asking the same question 4, 5, 6 times over, you're not misspeaking, are you? You're just denying reality because you don't want to accept the answer.
Well, I say that it was a very crass comment, and I'm not saying that it was in any way condoning what she said. When I mentioned the age factor, I think part of it is it's a kindness thing, really. She's an old lady and she is from a different generation. And I completely agree. It was, when you read the transcript, you think, what on earth was she thinking? Why did she do that? But it's not so much that she should be treated differently because of her age. It's more that, wouldn't it be a bit nicer if we lived in a society where people could be forgiven when they profusely apologise? And as Ngozi Fulani wanted her to be forgiven and didn't want her to lose her job over it, isn't it a bit of a shame that we're all still having a massive go at an 83-year-old lady with a lot of public service behind her?
I mean, Adam, a number of people have... there's been a lot of commentary about this in the newspapers, on radio and what have you, and a number of people have come forward and said, does this show that Meghan Markle was right all along? If you remember, Meghan Markle said that the questions and concerns were raised about the colour of the skin of the baby Archie before he was born. I mean, what's your response to this?
Yes, I think that's the bigger question, isn't it? What happened here was awful. Worse than condescending. I mean, as Ngozi Fulani has said, I mean, this was abuse. This was racist abuse at an event which was about the prevention of abuse and should have been a safe space. But really, in the interview that I saw earlier, Ngozi Fulani was saying, well, nobody from the palace has contacted me directly. And this is an opportunity for us to learn, what does this represent? I don't accept the age question. There was a live debate in Britain in the 60s and in the 70s when Lady Hussey would have been in her 20s or her 30s about race. I mean, my mother is in her 80s. She would not do that. I don't think that is acceptable. And it does raise the question because, Meghan Markle, the only person of colour in over 1,000 years of the history of the royal family, there's been a member of the royal family, there's been a person of colour, and said, she had to distance herself from the royal family because of her experience of racism. And that's the bigger question, isn't it? We have systemic racism throughout our society, No institution, I think, is immune to this. And you have to say, again, based on this experience, what it represents in terms of the royal household, then I think it gives absolute credence to the lived experience of Meghan Markle, and she's in the best position of anyone to speak truth to power in terms of the royal family and their attitude to racism.
Let's take a few more points from the audience. Yes, the woman in there in the glass, the grey sweater.
So you mentioned, right, that she had a lifetime of public service. If she is so willing to be openly disrespectful and rude, as is battering somebody with repeated questions, regardless what the question is, should she have that position in the first place, and should her stepping down perhaps not be more fitting? Because the palace has so many resources, they have access to this, and if she is unable to move past this and still results to her being racially abusive, should she really be functioning as a representative in the palace?
OK, let me tell you, I'm just going to come back around a bit. The woman at the back with the pink and white top on.
I was just going back to the fact that she persisted in asking the same question, which just shows it was more of an ingrained racism, perhaps, rather than just a gaffe.
Yeah. Well, let me just ask, I'm absolutely not taking a view in this one way or the other in terms of what Olivia's saying here, but because you are all very much taking the view that Lady Susan, clearly no one is saying that what Susan Hussey said was in any way acceptable, but no one's taking the view that you're taking, which is that maybe she shouldn't have gone. Is anyone in the audience agreeing with Olivia about that? OK, let's just hear from a couple of you. Yes, the man there in the blue sweater, and then I'll come to you.
Yeah, I agree entirely there that I don't think it's taken as a racist comment. Many years ago...
You don't think it should be taken as a racist comment?
No, I don't.
Well, even though the woman hearing it very much took it like that?
Yes, and that's one side of the story, Fiona. Many years ago, I was in a room when King Charles came in, and I was wearing a different regimental stable belt from everybody else because I was attached to the regiment. He made a beeline for me to ask why I was different. I took that as a compliment, that he had the time it was inquisitive. It's not necessarily a racist comment.
Do you not think it's a very different situation when you're white? Well, when you're being talked to by a white person's seniority. Shavanah, do you want to? I mean,
OK, I think that it's also important. You know, Meghan Markle's just been mentioned. Now, this person was also responsible for helping Meghan Markle understand the ropes and the structures of the palace, and as she was joining the family, and so the reaction of the palace has got to be based on maybe not just this incident, but also other matters that we are currently not aware of. So I think that's important for us to consider. The other thing is that when someone who has continuously had that question throughout my existence, where are you really from? That question comes continuously. It doesn't change. It's quite often the same question. And I'll be honest with you, I've got to a point now where I've done a DNA test so that I can actually just go, here you go, it's on my phone, this is where I'm from. Because and that's my default position, because I'm bored of that conversation. I am bored of that conversation. I'm sick to death of having to justify who I am or where I come from. Because ultimately what this person is telling me is that somehow my existence in their presence is perhaps unbearable. And that's what this comes down to. And it is about people's feelings, but also this is to do with society and who we want to be. This is not the kind of society that we want to live in. And clearly the palace, is considered that position.
All right. OK, briefly, because I'm going to move on.
We're saying that the palace is racist. It's not in any way racist. Never has been. You're hearing one side of a story, one side of a conversation. If it was a serious racial abuse, the first step should have been to go to the palace, not to go onto Twitter and put it around the world.
I'll just say, because I'm going to move on in a minute, but the palace has accepted that these comments were unacceptable. They're in no doubt about that. They have absolutely not defended Susan Hussey, and they've said that what Ngozi Fulani went through was completely unacceptable,
Absolutely.
and that racism was unacceptable. They're not sharing your view.
I have no qualms with that, but I don't think it was intentional racism.
OK. Well, look, I'll leave you with your thought. There's not a lot of agreement, I have to say, here in the room with you, but thank you for putting your point. We want to hear all points of view. Let me tell you where we will be next week. Question time will be in Bishop Auckland in County Durham. And then the week after that is our last show of the series before Christmas, and we will... Christmas already. And we will be in Winchester in Hampshire. So if you'd like to be part of the audience for either of those two programmes, go to the Question Time website and follow the instructions there. Right, let's take another subject now, which a lot of you have asked about, from Lynn Martin.
Would removing tax breaks from private schools be an attack on aspiration or an unfair privilege?
Right, so this is something that was discussed at Prime Minister's Questions, of course, on Wednesday, and Labour are calling for the charitable status to be removed from private schools. David, this is not something, obviously, that the Conservative government supports. No,
we've got two, in Monmouth, my hometown, we've got two excellent private schools. They do a huge amount, actually, to support people from less well-off backgrounds, giving scholarships. They're also a very big employer in the town, and I'm disappointed that Labour, at a national level, are clearly embarking on some sort of class war-type crusade to shut down public or private schools. And, you know, the reality is, right, Labour have been in power running the education system in Wales for 20 years, more than 20 years, and standards in Wales are lower than they are in England. You've got less chance of getting GCSE or A-levels in schools in Wales than you have in England. It's not me that's saying that. That comes from the independent OECD PISA reports. I mean, these are people who've looked at education systems around the place. It's not my opinion, and it's an absolute fact. And
so
to be honest with you,
giving private schools tax breaks help with that?
Well, it's not going to help if they shut down private schools and we have more people going into the state system. What I want to see is a much better state system in Wales, and I think it's unacceptable that the Labour Education Minister a few years ago was all over the Western Mail. Sir, it was Labour have admitted in the past that the system is poorer in Wales. The Education Minister apologised for this. He apologised for it, but an apology is not good enough. Labour need to accept they're running schools in Wales. They get more money per head to spend on schools than pupils in England, and yet the results are poorer. And I'd be very interested to hear what Vaughan's got to say and when we're going to see an improvement in the state sector in Wales, rather than just trying to shut down private schools or whip up a bit of a fuss about them.
Vaughan?
Well, actually, there have been improvements in the quality of education in Wales during the period of devolution, in particular in the last decade, so let's just deal with that. The question is really about, should we, all of us in this room, be helping to fund private schools? And I think the answer to that is no.
We're not funding
it. It's £1.7 billion they get from the taxpayer to subsidise private education. And actually, the school fees for private education have gone up in, the IFS said this today, 23%, I think, since 2015. So there's been a real terms increase in the fees, and they're still getting money because they're considered to be a charity and get other tax breaks as well. I don't see how that's justifiable in modern Britain, and it's fairly ridiculous for the Prime Minister to say that wanting to take the tax breaks from private education to put that into state education, where 93% of the population send their children, is an attack on aspiration. My parents were aspirations for me. I'm very proud to go into my local comprehensive. There are lots of people who go to their local schools who have high aspirations for themselves, their children, and their community. This is actually about what is fair, what should we be doing with your taxes, should we carry on giving a tax rate to private education? The answer to that is no. The Prime Minister should recognise he's just out of touch and on the wrong page on this.
The woman in the orange sweater.
I would like to say that I think if private schools were closed, then the parents of the children who go there would be very involved with the state system, and it might well improve things.
I mean, no one's suggesting closing them, but what Labour is suggesting is taking away the charitable status.
Yeah, if it's just unfair. It's unfair. And it's unfair for the 93% who can't afford to go to private schools. It's in 21st century Wales, it makes no sense whatsoever.
The man next to you.
Well, I lived in Scandinavia for 16 years, and we don't need to have private schools there. If we spent the money and the time improving our education system instead of putting money into these schools, I think it would be a better idea and a better spent money anyway.
Okay, Adam.
The existence of private schools is really, you know, a central part of why the UK is one of the most unequal societies in Europe. it perpetuates that inequality. And there are some European countries that actually do make it illegal to have private education because they think morally it's wrong for you to try and buy an advantage for your children and perpetuate that level of inequality. Certainly, we shouldn't be supporting it through the tax system at all.
Does Plaid Cymru support abolishing private schools?
Well, I certainly think that we shouldn't be subsidising it, and there's an opportunity for us in Wales, isn't there? Because Labour has said that at Westminster they're going to get rid of the business rate subsidy. They've done it in Scotland. Why haven't we done it yet in Wales?
Well, as you know, it's part of the work we're jointly looking on reviewing the tax system. Well, yeah, so we are actively looking at the question.
Yes, but you consulted on it in 2020. Get on and do it. You know, let's provide that leadership. You know.
Okay. The man at the very back in the stripy jacket. Yes.
Hi. Well, if education is a devolved power within Wales, can the Labour Welsh Government implement this policy in advance of a general election?
Exactly.
I don't think we can deal with charitable status. That's not devolved, and it's the charitable status that is the biggest one of the tax breaks. We are looking and reviewing business rates, which is one of the things they get a break from as well. We have a handful of schools here. There are obviously lots more over the border. So we're looking at our powers and our response. The big deal, though, is charitable status, and that's what makes up the majority of the £1.7 billion of your money that private schools get every year.
Okay.
Sorry, isn't the biggest part of that also VAT, not applicable
and
to
again,
fees?
that's not devolved. So you've got to ask questions about why this exists and what we can do about it.
If all those schools were closed down, they wouldn't be paying any tax anyway. You're not going to be any better off. There's no subsidy going to these schools.
Look, I don't have a
problem. In fact, if you take children, if you shut those schools down, take children out, they're all going to go into the nearest state secondary school, which means that they're going to be under even greater pressure than they are.
That's if you shut them down, and
we're not proposing doing
it. Well, that's obviously what's behind all of this, isn't it? That's why you're looking at all the tax
breaks. If you want to pay
breaks.
for your children to go to private school, that's your choice. But I shouldn't subsidise it with my taxes. My constituents shouldn't, and neither should any of you.
Okay. The man at the front with the walking stick.
Not all, but most of our recent prime ministers and most of the cabinets have all had private education. When we consider the many disasters that they've visited on us, is that not a better excuse to just close the damn things down?
Right. So, yes, 65% of the cabinet were privately educated, since you mentioned it. Olivia?
Well, I look at this from, I think, quite a sort of pragmatic angle. I think that Labour's policy of getting rid of charitable status would end up with the result of closing down a lot of private schools, because lots of parents who send their children to private schools skimp and save to do so. And we're not just talking about sort of Eton and Harrow here. There are small private schools in small rural areas which do quite a lot of good for the community. And I do worry about those children then being put on the state sector, which is already under a lot of strain. I also think that parents are going to find a way to confer privilege on their children, whether or not private schools exist. I went to a very good state school, and there were parents there who wanted to send their children to a state school because they were ideologically preferred that, but ended up sort of getting around that by giving them lots of extra tuition on the side, lots of tennis lessons, lots of music lessons, etc. And basically parents are going to want the best for their children, and they're going to find a way of doing that one way or the other. And if they're rich, they might think that spending it on education is the right way of doing that. And I don't think you can sort of get around that. I think it's ridiculously overly ideological to think that by closing down private schools you're going to stamp out inequality, when private schools are doing quite a lot of good in quite a lot of communities.
But if we were to get rid of private schools completely, you'd have all those parents then engaging with the state education sector, wouldn't they? They would then be investing in making sure that our state schools, succeeded to the best of their ability. What they've done is they've completely, turned their back on the state system. They're not engaged with it at all. So there would be a transformational effect just by the fact that all the children would be going to the state sector.
That's such a patronising attitude.
And that's part of the success of the Scandinavian school system. Look at the Finns, one of the most successful education systems in the world, because everyone goes to the same schools.
Well, I don't think...
I love the way you assume that parents who send their children to a local state school are incapable of engaging and actually improving the standards of those schools. Why do you think that parents... Hang on. Why are you thinking that somebody who's gone to a private school is going to be better at improving the state sector than somebody who's gone to a state school as I have myself.
That's not what I said. The point is everyone should be engaged, everyone working together, and you know, that sense of...
also forgetting the impact of some of the good private schools, the work that they do in their community. So, for example, there was a private school down the road from my state school, and girls from my state school would go to that private school for Oxbridge entry help, and they gave us their playing fields for sports days and for activities, etc. There is good work that private schools do in the community, and as David says, they also produce quite a lot of jobs, and that they're a fantastic export. I mean, there are branches of really good English private schools opening up in the Far East. That should be something to be proud of. I don't understand why we're stomping on something which...
They don't need £1.7 billion of our taxes to do that.
Let me bring Shavanah in, who's not had a chance to get a word in edgeways.
I have young children. They go to a state school. I went to a local comprehensive school. I'm here. I think that what we need to be very aware of is, I think, the comment that was made about when you look at the UK government at this moment in time, when you look at the makeup of the cabinet and the decisions that they've been taking. So this is about elitism, and this is about, you know, creating that two-tier system. And we're just adding to the problem. That kind of like the haves and the have-mores, as has, you know, previously been mentioned. And I think is also quite ludicrous, really, of the Tories to be accusing the Labour Party of trying to start this class war by suggesting that they make private schools pay VAT, because I think it's actually a fair question to ask, given that I think it featured in one of the Tory manifestos in 2017 as a possible option as well. So, you know, they're asking something that, you know, the Tories had already discussed previously. So, and you're talking about, you know, the amount of money that you pay for fees is like double the median salary for the average worker in the UK. I mean, you've got to think about that one.
OK, let's take another question. From Rodri Lloyd.
As images emerged today of ambulances backing up outside hospitals for 40 hours and having personal experience myself of waiting for an ambulance that never came, what does the panel suggest as a solution to the continuing crisis with ambulance waiting times?
So, of course, we've got the worst ambulance waits on record. That was announced today. We've also got a pending ambulance workers' strike, paramedic strike. Rod, you talk about your own experience. What was your experience?
May last year, my daughter had her first epileptic seizure.
And she was how old?
She was 3. Awful, but you do what you do. You ring 999, and the call handler was excellent. But you just got the feel that they couldn't understand why we were waiting so long. And being told, your instinct as a parent, right, OK, if it's taking long, put them in the car, take them yourself. Being told then, don't do it, because if anything happens on your head, be it. To then a few hours later being told...
A few hours later?
Hours, a fair few hours, having a phone call from the ambulance service saying, listen, we're not going to get to you, take it yourself. To then where she subsequently had a second seizure in the local hospital. And then having been met then with staff saying, where have you been? We were waiting. Wow. And at no point do I blame the ambulance crews or anything. To be honest with you, they're heroes. Because anybody that can go to anybody's door in a shift, maybe 6 times they've had to go, and what they did to us, and they said, sorry, and keep doing it and doing it and doing it.
But so you had to wait hours? I mean, that must have been terrifying for you.
It was awful, just because you're left in a position then where her epilepsy is as such that she'll go into status, where it can go on for half an hour, and part of the care is to say, just ring 999, tell them what's going on. It's a case of not losing trust. You lose faith. Right. Because you're constantly thinking, well, I'll ring, but will it come?
OK. So, Vaughan, let me come to you. Obviously, health was your watch previously. What does the panel suggest, is what Roger's asking, as a solution to this current crisis? Now, health is a devolved matter in Wales. Can you not sort this out?
Yeah, first I want to say I'm really sorry for the experience that you and your family have had, Rodri. When I was the health minister, we started to see real improvements in ambulance waits and what it meant not just to wait for an ambulance, but actually getting people out of a hospital as well. Since the pandemic, we've seen things get much worse than they were beforehand. And that's both about the staff that we have. It's also about the significant increase in activity in our healthcare system. And it's not just at the front doors. You have this challenge of getting people to the right place for their care. So some people don't need to go into hospital. That's only part of the answer. It's also a challenge of getting the right numbers of staff into the whole service. We've increased the training for NHS staff numbers in all my time as a health minister and continued.
But just given that Labour have been in power in Wales for 20 years, and Rodri's experience, and everyone accepts the pandemic has made things worse, but nonetheless,
if you let me
there was an underlying problem. How is it still so bad?
The biggest issue is our challenge of getting people out of hospital when they no longer need to be there. Because in every general hospital in Wales, there will be people who no longer need to be in hospital. It's actually social care that's our biggest challenge, to unlock this problem. And
that has devolved as well.
It is. And to actually give us the capacity we need in social, we need to invest in the numbers of people we have. And it is also about health and local government and the individual private homes that often operate in parts of Wales working more successfully together. So it's partly about resources, but if we can't resolve the social care issue, then we won't get there. That's why we're looking again at whether we should use our tax powers or not to have a social care levy, to put more money in on a progressive basis. The conversation about resources is entirely linked to this, and you know as well as I do that in real terms our budget has gone down. If we can resolve resources into social care, and the fix that was due to come at a UK level would have helped us from a resource point of view here, then I think we could have done something about that to make sure that you and other families, I know there are other families like you, Rodri, who have an unacceptable experience in our system at present.
Does that answer your question? Are you satisfied with that?
It answers it to an extent where earlier on this week, bearing in mind my daughter had a diagnosis, she come home, we deal with it, we go through the hell that is trying to find the right level of medication. This week, this Monday, I had a phone call from our community nurse that specialises in children with illnesses in the community, in tears, because she's got to stop being our nurse. We haven't got one anymore. She's been taken off us. So it's all well and good saying support in the community. It was there. We had it. Bear in mind, we had to wait for it. We had it. It's been taken off us.
And now
It's gone.
Shavanah.
Look, as someone who talks to healthcare workers on a daily basis, including ambulance workers, we know that resources are overstretched. Staff are absolutely shattered. They're knackered. What you were saying, Rodri, about the fact that, you know, when the ambulance crew did arrive, the first thing they did was to apologise to you. That happens on a regular basis. And I think that ultimately this is very telling in terms of, you know, the fact that ambulance workers are now set to take industrial action, as of course are nurses. You know, nurses haven't actually balloted for industrial action for over 100 years. And they're doing that for a multiple number of reasons. One, because pay has been held back for such a long time, and inflation, proof pay rises are absolutely necessary. But also, in addition to that, they are really worried about the fact that there's not enough staff, and they're worried about patient care as well, and what potentially might go wrong on their watch. And they don't want anything to go wrong on their watch. They're really worried about our public services. They want our public services to work. And they're also really concerned about the fact that, you know, they have, you know, ambulance workers have, you know, people, you know, in ambulances for a very long time, unfortunately, outside hospitals, because we can't get people out. And that is a lot to do with our structures. I think that the Welsh Government has done some good work in terms of social care, for example. They've now introduced the real living wage. You know, we've got a social care forum that the unions work in social partnership with government. And we are also looking at the possibilities of taking, you know, any form of profit out of social care so that we can bring it back in line with the NHS. But we need investment. But ultimately, this is about funding. Now, unless we can get more money for Wales, unless we have a fairer funding settlement for Wales, we are going to struggle going forward.
Well, let's put that. We've got the Secretary of State for Wales here.
Obviously, the service that you got, sir, was completely unacceptable, and people are suffering that kind of service on both sides of the border, right? So this isn't a Wales-only problem. It is worse in Wales. People are waiting longer for ambulances in Wales. There are more people on waiting lists in Wales. People are waiting longer in accident and emergency. And it can't be just down to funding, because actually for every pound that the UK government spend in England on the health service, they give £1.20 per head for Wales to spend. We saw a record-breaking budget given to the Welsh Government at the last budget, which was an extra £2.5 billion or so, another £120 billion in the autumn statement, because that's the one thing we've protected, is the health service and actually also education. So Labour have been in charge for 20 years, over 20 years, with the health service. They have to explain, Vaughan's been the health minister, they have to acknowledge there's a problem before they can begin to address it. And there is a problem.
What about the government? I mean, the UK government.
The UK government.
UK government's been in power for 12 years.
Yeah, but the UK
government's been in power for 12 years of the UK.
Yes.
And clearly we've got nurses going on strike for the first time nationwide. We've got ambulance strikes. Well,
so that's a wider issue. So on the issue of nurses going on strike, I think that obviously is regrettable. I mean, nurses do a fantastic job. So do ambulance drivers. But if nurses get a 19% pay rise, which is what they're asking for, then everyone else will want a 19% pay rise, which would be understandable. Then we get more inflation the next year. What the UK government is trying to do is to get to grips with inflation, to bring down inflation, and also to make sure that the most vulnerable in society, those who are on benefits, pensioners, households where there are people who are disabled, that they're all supported, and there's a £37 billion package for that, and to increase the minimum wage, so that those on low pay also don't suffer. So we acknowledge, again, let's acknowledge problems. There's a problem within the health service in the UK, in England. There's a bigger problem in Wales, and Vaughan won't admit it. And he can't put it down to budgets because they are getting more money per head.
But
they're
prioritising lifting the bankers' bonuses. They should be equalising capital gains tax and income tax. If we did that, we believe as the TUC that most workers in the public sector would be able to receive an inflation-proof pay rise. If we pay people properly, they will want to keep working in our services. We'll be able to recruit to those jobs.
There are a lot of hands up, and I want to hear from some of them. Woman here in the front in the blue sweater.
A couple of weeks back, there was a RTA outside our house.
A road traffic accident.
Yeah. A young lady collapsed on the floor on the road, in the middle of the road. Now, myself, my daughter and my husband went out to her. There was only her there. She fitted and she stopped breathing. So we did CPR while I was on the phone to the emergency services. I was having direction from the emergency services telling me that there was no ambulance available, but there will be one soon.
Well, even though she'd stopped breathing?
She stopped breathing, so my husband and myself were doing CPR, and my daughter was there. It got to stage, we got to 20 minutes, and I was pleading and begging the call handler, and I was probably sounding very irrational at the time. Please, please come out. This lady has stopped breathing, and we're trying to save her life. In the meantime, we're in the road while cars are speeding past, by the way, so we were putting our own lives at risk. Half hour before a police car turned up. When he turned up, he got out, he took over from us so that we were aiding him, helping him. He still got the call handler taking direction of what to do to save this girl's life.
So when did an ambulance turn up?
It was a good nearly 2 hours before an ambulance turned up, because they were stuck over. We live in North Powys, and they were stuck obviously in Shrewsbury or Telford Hospital, because that's where our nearest one for us is, which is what, 40-50 miles away. When they did finally turn up, they then had to call the air ambulance, which is another issue in Mid Wales, because they're trying to campaign to keep the air ambulance there. And, we are fighting a campaign to keep it there. Nothing, we were dealing with something we shouldn't have been. And while we're on the subject, there was no blankets. So I had to give 3 blankets from my house, because these police cars that did finally turn up, and the ambulance didn't even have any blankets for this young girl who was, clearly in a bad state.
Woman here in the turquoise jacket here in the front.
Can I go back to what Mr Davies said about getting people with their benefits, getting that support to them? Citizens Advice today have said that there are lots of people struggling, and if there was more resource going into organisations like Citizens Advice, we could actually make sure people got the benefits they needed. That would improve their state of health, and there'd be less demand on the health service as a consequence. Is there something you can do to help charities like Citizens Advice,
I think Citizens Advice Bureau do a very, very good job indeed, and I've always worked with them as a constituency MP, so I can't answer that one straight away, but I mean, I'm sure that both Welsh Government and UK Government would recognise that work and look at ways of doing it, because your point's a fair one, actually. So,
Man here in the red sweater.
I want to come over a few things, basically, because I feel very strongly, although the money's going into the health service, right, it's going to the wrong area. The majority of that is going into the administration, right? So take the money off the administration and give it to the workers. Simple as that. That's one way of getting your workforce back and happier. Second thing, I want to share a very personal thing on the social aspect of the community social. I was left for dead just over 8 weeks ago, right in my own home. I couldn't stand up. My leg had swelled and the pain was agonising. My bladder had been going silly, everything like that. I was totally covered in everything, right? And I kept begging and begging over the phone, please get a social worker out to me, please get some community nurses out to me.
What was this to 999, are you saying?
And none of this happened, right?
Sorry, and were you ringing 999, just so I
had rang on one occasion, and in the end, some paramedics did come out, an ambulance did come out. They took me to A&E, right, up here in the hospital. And then, after I'd been seen in A&E, I still could not stand. I could not move. My bladder had been going silly again. I wear pads because I have to, and they were very heavy. I couldn't do anything about it. I was dripping all over the place. Every time I tried to stand up in my home, I fell over.
Right.
What could I do? My brother saved my life. I spoke to my sister on the phone and told her what my situation was. So she asked my brother to come all the way from the Wirral with his son to help me.
Okay. Well, let's get a response from our panel, shall we? Adam.
The stories, these heart-rending stories, are what we're hearing now, constantly throughout Wales. Everyone has their own experience of, the health service. Born in Wales, it's on life support, isn't it? It's dying before our very eyes. These stories that you were sharing about nurses crying. How many of us have experienced that? Nurses crying after their shift. Nurses crying with patients on wards because of the extreme stress that they're under. And on top of that, as Shav was saying, not only working under this constant stress coming after the pandemic, and feeling undervalued because of, the pay award. And it has to be, I've got to say this as well, Unison, a Labour-affiliated union, saying that the Welsh Labour government's pay offer is derisory. These were the people that we clapped throughout the pandemic, rightly. And now, with inflation...
Do you think the nurses, for example, the nurses should get the full pay award that they're asking for?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think the case is clear, isn't it? Why are people... Part of the problem that we're facing in terms of the state of the service is people are leaving it. They're leaving it through burnout. And they're deciding to work as agency nurses. They get far better treated as agency nurses that are brought back into the health service, backdoor privatisation effectively. Why don't we actually use that money, 134 million that we spent in Wales on agency nurses, that money could be used actually to give the nurses a decent pay rise and invest in the future. And you've got to remember this derisory pay offer, way below inflation, but 4-5% when inflation is now 11%. That comes on the back of 12 years of real terms pay cut for public sector workers. So there's a challenge here. There's a challenge here. Yes, we get an unfair settlement from the Westminster government, and we've got to demand fairness. But there are things that the Welsh government can do. We have income tax powers. We have those income tax powers for a reason.
Adam,
why don't we use them to give our NHS staff and other public service workers a decent pay rise?
Yeah, and Olivia's not had a chance to speak yet. Olivia.
Well, I think the experiences that we've heard tonight are pretty horrifying, and I think it speaks to a truth that the NHS as it is, I hate to say it, that it's not functioning properly, it's not fit for purpose. And we can keep saying that it's about funding, but it's not really true. The government's now spending 50%.
What, not true at all?
Well, the government's spending 50% of all public spending, day-to-day public spending, is now on the NHS. It's essentially an NHS with a rest of a state attached to it. And yes, we need more money for health, but I think the only way to do that, instead of pouring more and more money into the black hole of the NHS is to think about serious structural reform about how the NHS is funded. And of course that doesn't mean copying America's model, which clearly doesn't work, but looking at the French model or the German model, a mixed social insurance model. Surely that's what we've got to be talking about now. It just clearly isn't working. Listen to what we're hearing tonight.
OK, all right. We haven't got much longer on the programme, and I want to get one more question in from Gwenda Williams.
Is belief in God an outmoded belief in the 21st century? And if so, is that a good thing?
So, Gwenda, I think you're referring to the census, which suggests that for the first time ever, less than half of people in England and Wales now describe themselves as Christian, and the number who said they had no religion at all increased to 37.2%. What's your view, Gwenda?
I'm an atheist on the agnostic side of the spectrum, really, because nobody really knows. But while religion has done good things in the past, it's also done an awful lot of bad things in the past and in the present.
So do you welcome this?
Sorry?
So do you welcome the fact that...
I would welcome a decline in religion, and particularly the sorts of religion that oppress and repress and are misogynistic. I would welcome a decline in those.
OK. David?
Well, I don't really think it's a good idea to mix up politics and religion. I don't think politicians are wise to start suggesting that their religious views should be imposed on anyone else. And I don't really want to go into mine in particular, but I do agree with you. There are aspects of some religions that can be seen as misogynistic, and that's something that we should look at as a society. There are people within all religions who can behave in a misogynistic way, or use their text, if you like, to justify texts that may have been written hundreds or thousands of years ago, to justify attitudes that I think are outmoded. But I don't want to get into a religious discussion, if you don't mind, because I'm not overly religious, and there have been times when I've been brought up as an Anglican, and I felt a bit fed up with the Anglican Church because I felt they're so left-wing, so there's not much of a home for a conservative like me in the local church.
Shavanah?
So I think that faith and politics are two separate issues. And when it comes to making decisions as far as legislation is concerned, they should be separate matters. I am a Muslim, Welsh Asian woman myself. That's how I identify. But it's a private matter for me and how I practice my faith and who I am. For me, it's about equality, justice, freedom. That is ultimately the basis on how I operate as a human being.
So in terms of the question, Shavanah, is belief in God an outmoded belief, given what we've seen in the census? That's why you're asking, Gwenda. And if so, is that a good thing? Well, is it a good thing that fewer people believe in God?
I think that some people may be hoping that they would get a bit of a dog whistle out with some of the data, if I'm honest with you, and they would be able to somehow identify that all of a sudden we have more people of other faiths in the UK rather than those that are classing themselves as Christians.
Well,
and they didn't get that.
It's only risen a very, very tiny amount.
Tiny little fraction.
Yeah.
But also I think that, ultimately faith is a private matter for most people. And for lots of people, they pick it, and those people who have faith quite often pick and choose the different bits that they like and don't like. So, yeah.
Yes, because we were talking before we came about you putting up the Christmas tree.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
Absolutely.
The man there in the black and grey shirt with the glasses.
I have a very academic opinion on the matter of religion because as a Muslim I've always had my faith be the minority faith in this country. I have always been in an environment where my faith was minority. Even in a school where the majority of children were Muslim, the supermajority, 99% or more, my faith was still minority, and it was underneath, treated as on a lower level than the Christian faith. Now, the idea of that has motivated me to think about religion in a lot of different terms, but the salient one for the question of
I might have to speed you up because we're running out of time. I'm so sorry.
Of the decline of religion being a good or a bad thing, particularly in terms of religion as an institution, is that historically all institutions were religious and all religions were institutions. And the difference between the two is a very modern concept, and trying to intertwine the idea of religious morality with institutional morality, which has historically been
I'm going to really have to hurry you up, because I'm so
really
sorry, because I've got to bring the panel in.
The idea that religion's decline is good or bad should not be tied to whether acts that have been committed by religious institutions are good or bad.
OK, thank you. I'm sorry, because we've only got about 3 minutes left. Vaughan.
Look, I don't think people should be particularly worried about whether a decline in people who identify themselves as Christians is a good or a bad thing. And actually the decline is the movement from people who said they were Christians in the last census, people who have no religion in this one. It isn't the significant growth of other faiths. And interestingly, recent migrant communities are much more likely to be communities of faith. I just think that when you look at what religion does and doesn't do, lots of the values we have that we identify as being positive, a lot of them are founded in messages for lots of mainstream faiths. I don't have a problem with that. It's more likely, when you talk about the bad things that happen in the name of religion, it's the men and women, and normally men, who use a religion for their own purposes. And, you know, I was married in a Catholic church. I don't have a problem with people of faith. I was in a mosque just a week ago on Friday as well. It's part of who we are still, but it will change, no doubt, in time.
Olivia.
I agree with most of what Vaughan said there, actually. I think that...
what do you mean, oh dear? That's telling.
I think that lots of the values that we hold dear are sort of rooted in all different sorts of religion, and that it's good that we do hold those values dear. Things like, you know, helping the weak, being kind, being generous. But I think, you know, whether it matters or not that people are now saying that they don't believe in God on the census, never quite sure why that question's on the census at all. I think, as I think everyone has said in some way, it's a pretty personal matter, and I like the way that in this country we do sort of separate church and state the way we do.
Adam?
I think that organised religion, I think, has had a pernicious effect. You know, it's kind of hierarchical, it's dogmatic, exclusionary. But if we change, and I think certainly there's this very strong argument now with the diversity of belief systems, and I would include humanism and atheism as a belief system, then there's a strong argument for certainly not having an established religion. You know, we
so not having the Church of England.
Established church, yeah. We got rid of it in Wales 100 years ago, didn't we? And I think that needs to happen in England now too. But I think spirituality, I think, has a positive role. And, you know, we all want meaning out of our lives, don't we? And, you know, one of the things that I think churches and faith communities do well is give meaning to people's lives, and also, you know, mark the rites of passage during your life. But obviously, you know, that can be done as humanists and atheists as well. And having that respect between different belief systems, you know, I think is very, very important for us.
We've got 15 seconds left. The woman at the very back, because you've been sticking your hand up very eagerly. Yes, you, in the pink and yellow top.
I think I'll just be happy if we get to a place where our children go to school and religious education isn't this is what other people believe in and these are all other people's faiths, but this is mainly what we believe in, because I think that is where it's gone wrong, is that there are lots of different faiths and people can believe what they want, but please don't try and institutionalise our children to believe that Christianity is the only one.
Right, OK. On that note, Shavanah's nodding away to that.
My message is join a trade union.
All right. OK. Right. Our time is up. Thank you very much to the panel for coming along this evening. Thank you very much to the audience for coming along as well. Very good to hear what you've had to say. Of course, thank you to you at home for watching. If you can't stay up late, remember that we are live on the iPlayer at 8 o'clock every Thursday, but we're also, of course, on after 10 o'clock news. Thank you very much for watching from Aberystwyth. Bye-bye.